Good evening, everybody. Greetings and welcome to you all. I'm Kevin Bell. I'm the Executive Director of the Castan Centre for Human Rights Law, which is based in the Faculty of Law at Monash University. And you are with me and Deborah Glass, Victorian Ombudsman, for this, the next interview in my series, Human Rights Leaders in Conversation. Can I begin by acknowledging the country from which I'm calling, that is the country of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to those people and to their elders, past and present. I say that with particular emphasis because besides being the Executive Director of the Castan Centre, I am a Commissioner with the Yurruk Justice Commission, which is a truth-telling process which uniquely to Australia, indeed uniquely to the world, Victoria is undertaking into the impact of colonisation upon the First Peoples of Victoria. And so I bring to your attention the fact that this is happening, and I ask you to take interest in the Yurruk Commission and in the important issues which it is examining, to support the community, and particularly the First Peoples communities, for their involvement in this process, and to take an active interest in the process yourself. Human Rights Leaders in Conversation is an occasional series of interviews, the purpose for which is to present to the audience human rights leaders, such as, in this case, Victoria's Ombudsman, Deborah Glass, as I say, in order to give them an opportunity to discuss with me and through me, you, the issues that concern them, their own personal history and their particular office, in a way which I hope, and indeed they hope, will promote human rights, public understanding of human rights, and an interest in human rights. I am really honoured today to be with Deborah. I have, as a judge of the Supreme Court of Victoria, in particular, followed her career as an ombudsman. Her work has been as one of immense importance and remains so. And I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to speak with you, Deborah, and I want to thank you for participating in this interview today.
Thank you, Kevin, and I'm delighted to be here. And let me also acknowledge that I'm joining you from Bunurong country, and that country has never been ceded. And you know, I echo your remarks about the importance of truth and reconciliation and the importance of making these acknowledgements whenever we can.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, Deborah graduated from Monash Law School in 1982, worked for a year or two in a law firm in Melbourne, enough time to realise that that was not the life she wanted. She left beige Melbourne in 1985-ish, I think, for Europe, working for an investment bank initially in Switzerland, then moved across the continent to Hong Kong to work in the financial regulation sector, and in particular with the Hong Kong Securities and Futures Commission. Back again to Europe, and in particular to London, where she undertook a number of regulatory roles, but most particularly with the Police Complaints Authority between 2001 and 2004, and then a long stint with the Independent Police Complaints Authority between 2004 and 2014. So impactful was her work in that particular office that she was awarded the OBE in respect of that service. I'm not sure when that would have been, 2016 or so, I think. In that capacity, she handled many high-profile investigations in relation to police misconduct, and most famously of all the Hillborough Police Stadium collapse, or was it a fire? I'll ask you about that, Deborah, and that occurred over a long period of time. So there's the background that that brought Victoria's Ombudsman to this, back to this state, to our great benefit. And I think, Deborah, with that, telling of your personal journey, it's only right that I should quote to you, or quote back at you, I should say, because you refer to this quote yourself, and I was most interested that you did, of T.S. Eliot. "We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time." As I say, you left Melbourne in the mid-1980s and came back here in 2014 to your present position. Do you think that you have indeed arrived back at about the place you started and know it for the first time?
Well, I love that quote, and I can really relate to it, because I left Melbourne on a one-way ticket, swearing I'd never come back. So I worked as a lawyer long enough, if I can just elaborate slightly on that,
please.
bio, just to earn enough money to leave the country. So I actually knew on my first day I didn't want to be a lawyer, but I stuck with it, until I had enough of the one-way ticket and enough money to keep me going for traveling. So I'm actually a great example of don't plan your career, because I didn't plan any of this. And if anybody had told me when I left Australia that I would come back as Victoria's Ombudsman, I would have wondered what they were smoking. So it's not something that I ever planned or thought I would do. So the Australia I left behind, the Melbourne I left behind, and it was in January 1985, was a very different place, and I'm sure I was also a very different person. But it is true that you can go away for a very long period and come back and find that things have somehow fallen into place. And it was right for me to leave, but it was also right for me to come back when I did.
It's interesting that you say that your career has not been planned, and I'm intrigued by that, because you always seem to have landed in something that you were good at and that you were successful at, and I say that with respect to virtually all of the positions that I've named just before. If not planning, how is it that how would you explain that you've undertaken positions in which you've really made a strong contribution?
Well, I've gone for things that mattered to me. So I think I think while I didn't plan, I've been very driven by a sense of what's working, what's going to make a difference. When, for example, I finished with, I think it was in the end about 16 years in financial services regulation, and was thinking, what am I going to do next? It was a process of working out what I didn't want to do. So, and realizing that what I did want was to stay in the public sector, to do something meaningful. And it didn't really matter what. So, what came up? Well, I saw an advertisement one day for the Police Complaints Authority. And it was as random as that. And it was, and I happened to be doing some voluntary work at the time, visiting people in police cells, as a what was called an independent custody visitor.
An early example of your interest in people in custody.
Yeah, and that was my very early interest, because I wasn't doing that in financial services regulation. No. But it was it just seemed somehow meaningful, and so you choose things, or rather I chose things, not because I had sometimes because sometimes some of the positions I've gone for were because I really wanted to do it, like the Ombudsman, and sometimes they were because, why not? Give it a go. I
understand now why you tell your staff when you start a new position, you don't come to a new position with a 10-year plan. You come with a set of values and beliefs which you bring to the role. What are the values and beliefs that you think that you brought to your role as an ombudsman?
Well, integrity, independence. I've always had a passion for social justice and human rights. But what I was saying to my staff on that first day was, of course you don't have a plan on your first day. It would be so presumptuous to come into a role and think you know what you need to do. So, because when you come into a role like mine, which is a 10-year appointment, it's a tremendous opportunity to make a meaningful difference. But this was my first job back in Australia for nearly 30 years. You know, I would want to do an awful lot of listening and learning and understanding what that plan needed to be. In fact, I did have a plan before very long, but I didn't have it on my first day.
I understand. It would have been appropriate as a returner to the country after such a long break to come back with ideas that were too preformed. It would have impeded the course that you wanted to take in your position.
Yes, I think that it's incredibly important to understand. And one of the things I did say, I remember also, you know, on that first day was you bring those values, but you also bring certain ways of working. And one of the things that has always been very important to me is if you want to achieve change, and I see an important part of my role as achieving change is improving public administration, getting people to do it better. You've got to take people with you. You've got to achieve buy-in. You can't just, you know, wave a stick from on high and go, you know, you will do this better. You know, that's never going to work. People may pay lip service to your recommendations, but nothing will change unless they buy into what has gone wrong and what needs to be done to fix it.
I was struck when I first started following your work many years ago about the strength of the personal conviction which you brought to your role. You are obviously fearless. You are obviously independent. You emphasise, including in the comments that you've just made, the importance of integrity, of accountability. See that in various aspects of your previous work. And this job of being an ombudsman seems to be one that you really have truly made your own. You sit there in this interview as the ombudsman, completely in command of your position and your office, if I might say so. What is it, if you accept what I've just said, that seems to marry? What is it about this function that seems to marry with you so as to bring out this strong sense of personal conviction?
Well, nice of you to say so, Kevin. I mean, this is my perfect job. I will. I did say, and you know, only slightly tongue-in-cheek, that after how many years did I spend? 13 years of dealing with police complaints and corruption in the United Kingdom. That if I could design the perfect job for myself coming back to Australia, it would be dealing with all complaints involving public services, not including the police. And that is exactly what I do. There's a limit to how long you can, I think, spend dealing with
indeed
police complaints. But you know what I think, you know, some of this is just in my DNA. I mean, I must have been. I've always had a very strong sense of fairness. You know, recognition that this is not fair, and whether that and a reaction to things that are not fair. I attribute that to my upbringing, to my parents, to my community. I come from a community of Holocaust survivors, so I'm not from the mainstream. You know, you grow up with a sense of what it is like to deal with discrimination at its worst. And I think that, you know, those things sort of imbue you with a sense of social responsibility that has always been very important to me. Thank
you. When you left Australia in 1985-ish, the human rights climate here was very different. The ICCPR and ICESCA, the Economic, Social and Cultural Rights Covenant, had been in force for some years, but there was not enabling legislation like the charter we have here in Victoria, and there was discrimination legislation, but nothing like the kind of framework, as I say, that we have in Victoria, and I might say in Queensland and in the ACT. and I'm also happy to say is being considered among NGOs in Western Australia who have started a movement for Human Rights Act in that state. On your return, after what was it 30 years, did you find noticeable the change in the human rights climate, and in particular, could you see that the Charter was starting to have an impact or not, which was positive and relevant to your work as the Ombudsman?
Well, I think really interesting reflecting on those things. When I left Australia more than 30 years ago, I'm not even sure that I'd heard about human rights. These were not terms that were in general use. I don't think I ever thought about human rights and what human rights were. And I confess I had never heard of the Ombudsman. So even though the Ombudsman legislation had been around for a few years, these things were just not, they simply weren't in my consciousness. And I would bet, that would apply to just about everybody in the state. So I mean, human rights was incredibly important in my work in the UK and very front and centre to the work I was doing dealing with particularly deaths following police custody. Be very, very conscious of the European Convention of Human Rights, about investigations being compliant with, with Article 2 of the Convention, the right to life. So human rights, and human rights compliance was absolutely a huge part of my job in the UK. What I also saw, though, in the UK, and this was a less positive aspect of human rights, was how human rights was beginning to become a bit of a dirty word in some quarters.
Yes.
That it was, it was being used as shorthand, by the tabloids for the rights of criminals, over those of hardworking citizens. Why should we care about people's human rights? So there was also this negative side of the human rights conversation. Now, when I came back to Australia and discovered happily that there is a human rights charter now that's been around for, well over 10 years.
2006.
Absolutely, that the Ombudsman in fact has an explicit role in dealing with human rights. That was great. That was exciting. But it also seemed to me that Australia, or sort of Victoria specifically, even though further advanced than elsewhere in Australia because we had this legislation, human rights was not and still is not embedded in the public consciousness or in the consciousness of our public servants in the way it is in some other parts of the world.
Yes.
And so those are things that need to change and will change with time.
Do you find that concerning? I think I would summarise that remark by saying it is human rights are not yet embedded in our administrative culture or in the culture of public administration. Is that a fair way of describing it?
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yes.
And so there's and there are opportunities there. And the other thing I see with that is there are also opportunities, I hope, to avoid some of the negativity we've seen in places like the UK around a human rights culture that is, I think, can be quite mischievously misused. Yes.
Deborah, you're the first woman ombudsman. Is that important to you?
When I this was commented on a great deal in my first couple of years in the job. Are you really an ombudsman? Are you an ombudswoman? How does it feel to be the first female ombudsman of the state of Victoria? To which I replied that, well, my mother would have been very proud, and I'm sorry she wasn't here to see the day, because she was a tremendous warrior for equality.
Yes.
And I know that part of my passion for the job, I can
tell me more, Deborah. Tell me a little about her.
Well, she was a very, very different from the women of her generation. She always worked. fact, she had 3 children, and she was a wife and mother, like her generation, like the so many women who married in the 50s. But to my mother, her professional identity, her was incredibly important to her, and she came from a very humble background. She proudly described herself as a grocer's daughter, but she was, she educated herself, and she was scholarships, and what was really quite remarkable about not only her but my father was their how they epitomized for me gender equality. My father, who was a doctor, in many ways a conventional professional, retired quite early and used to type my mother's theses. So my mother, quite late in her life, had studied and obtained a master's in public administration, and my father did her typing, because my father was a better typist than my mother.
So your father typed your mother's theses. Well, there's a
he did not believe in gender stereotypes, and I think so the example they both set, the woman who started out doing the cooking and cleaning and eventually became really quite a formidable professional. And my father, who was very content and indeed felt honoured to do her typing.
Wonderful story. Thank you for sharing it with us. Now, just for those people who don't know as much about the Ombudsman and the basic facts of the role, let's dwell for a moment. Give me a thumbnail on the responsibilities of the Ombudsman. What kind of things can you inquire into? How do you carry out investigations, and what can you do about complaints?
Well, I'll give you sort of the 60-second version.
The 60-second version.
OMBO 101. So yes. I have a very broad jurisdiction, over 1,000 public sector entities, state and local government, effectively. Pretty much everything except the police and decisions of courts and such like, which clearly I don't investigate. But almost everything else, including now publicly funded bodies. So yes. That's a relatively recent extension. So my bread and butter is dealing with. What
is a publicly funded body? A university or?
Universities are public authorities already.
Hospitals?
But they could be, but charities, not NGOs.
NGOs.
Could also be publicly funded.
So interesting.
They could be charities performing public functions.
Yes, thank you. And how do you carry out your investigations?
Well, my bread and butter is dealing with complaints from the public, but I don't need to act on complaint. I also have own motion powers.
Yes.
And I have, when I do in my full investigations, I have Royal Commission powers.
Yes.
So the work my office does will range from resolving the kinds of complaints that you can sort out in a phone call. Somebody complaining that they live in public housing and they haven't had any hot water for the last week, and they haven't been able to get a response from the department.
I see.
We can solve that in a phone call.
Yes.
Through to a major investigation involving potentially the use of coercive powers, summonses, interviews, documents, inspection of files, and so on.
I'm not sure it would be broadly understood that the social housing tenants could complain about such matters as being an aspect of government administration within your jurisdiction. That deserves to be more broadly known.
And indeed, it's one of those areas that I'm looking at making more broadly known, because we do get a lot of complaints about public housing. But I think that if it were more broadly known, we would get a lot more.
A lot more.
And part of the job, though, I should add, is that I don't just deal with complaints. What or indeed investigate systemic matters on my own motion. I also want to help the public sector do it better. So I have an education function.
Yes.
And one of the things we do with that is, we will develop guides, good practice guides for how to deal with complaints, and work with agencies, work with departments to help them to do it better. Because it's not just the Ombudsman slams, and I'm very conscious that the kind of, that the Ombudsman is known for the big headline cases, the ones where I've had a good slam, on some agency, even some individuals.
Naming and shaming.
But that's not, that is not the most important part of what I do. If I can issue guidance, if we can educate people, if we can have training programs that mean that local councils, for example, can do a better job of dealing with the tens of thousands of complaints they get every year from people in Victoria, then actually that's what I want to be my legacy.
Thank you. You're listening to Kevin Bell, the Executive Director of the Castan Centre for Human Rights Law, in conversation with the human rights leader, Deborah Glass, Victoria's Ombudsman. Deborah, you've conducted a lot of investigation in 8 years or so. You've observed a lot about human nature, a lot about government administration. You've spoken a lot of truth to power. I wonder if you could share with us an example or two of you making a difference for somebody who had a serious personal stake in the complaint as an individual.
I mean, there are so many cases, but let me share one with you that actually is not one that created a lot of headlines, but is one that it was one of my early cases and one of my early reports tabled in Parliament. But it's one that still stays with me, and I think in part because it's the complainant for me is the embodiment of what I describe as the imbalance of power between the individual and the state, which I think is the Ombudsman's role. So this is an investigation I did some years ago into the financial collapse of an aged care home called Mentone Gardens. And this was a supported residential service. It was regulated by the Department of Health. It wasn't a public government agency, but when it collapsed, it took with it the savings to the tune of over $4 million of its very elderly residents, and the impact that had on those people was massive. That wasn't just their money; it was their dignity, it was their independence, it was their peace of mind. It was, they could no longer buy presents for their grandchildren because their money had gone. So. And one of the chief complainants in this case, a man who I came to know and admire enormously, and he was 90 years old at the time, a man called Alan Lorraine, complained. He complained first to the Department of Health and the ministers, and he finally complained to me. And it was one of the many thousands of complaints we get every year, and my staff looked into it, and as we will do, and in the more complex cases, we'll go and have a look at the files in the department and see whether we think we need to look into something in more detail. And we did. And, what we found in that case, which became a formal investigation, was what I described as a litany of failures by the Department of Health at the time.
An alphabet of woe.
Well, absolutely. And where this becomes an important story for me is that very early on, as we were in the investigation, what seemed really obvious was that the fair outcome for these people was to get their money back. These people who had lost collectively millions of dollars. Now, as the Ombudsman, I can make recommendations. I can't enforce my recommendations, and I certainly can't require anybody to pay out large sums of money. But at the time, I was so concerned about this that I wrote to the Minister of the day to say, the investigation is not yet finished, but I wanted to put you on notice that I'm minded to recommend that the government make ex gratia payments to these people. And I didn't get a response to that, but I carried on my investigation, and I tabled my report in Parliament pretty promptly, and I included in there as a formal recommendation, and I said in there, that I, having essentially put the government on notice, that I was going to. I tabled this report over in the middle of April, and I recommended that the government make these payments by the end of June.
Mm.
And I remember I met the families, or the residents and their families, it was at a meeting at the Mentone RSL, both early on when I announced the investigation and the day I tabled the report. And it was incredibly emotional. There were lots of tears.
Yeah.
But people were also saying to me, well, how are you going to enforce this? How is this going to make a difference? And could the government just hide it? And I said, I can't. I said to them, as I've just explained to you, I can't enforce my regulations, but I can and I will monitor them. Mm. That's that's what I do, and I will be monitoring this. And and I made it known to the minister that I would not only be monitoring, but that I would be ensuring that his response was public. That's what I do. Mm. And it's what I think the early debates referred to as the persuasive powers of the Ombudsman.
Yes.
That although we don't have the direct power to enforce, the power of public reporting, the power of public persuasion is what sits behind that. So the result of that investigation was that the government paid out over $4 million to these very needy individuals,
complainants.
And
and
I still and the you don't do these jobs for the thanks, heaven forbid. There are too many things we do that are thoroughly thankless.
Yes.
But I did receive some wonderfully personalized notes from some people in that case, and they really, if you ever have any doubt about why you do the job, gosh, I just go back and reread them.
I'm struck by the manner in which you empathized with the individuals from the point of view of the personal stakes that they had in that situation. You described the financial impact, the impact on them as elderly people. How important is it that people exercising public functions involving power over people understand what's at stake for individuals personally?
It's it could hardly be more important. And I do think one of my roles as Ombudsman, and particularly one of my roles as a human rights investigator, is to remind the bureaucracy, the public servants, that people are at the heart of their decision making. This is not about numbers and cases. I said this, in my WorkSafe investigation, that all too often decisions were made thinking, that as if people were numbers and cases and files, and every one of those is about a person. So, and people are at the heart of what I do. I'm my staff. They're at the heart of what we do. But more than that, they're at the heart of administrative decision making.
You just described then the human rights investigative work of the Ombudsman, and I note from your website that you actually describe the Ombudsman as Victoria's human rights investigator. And again, I'm not sure that that's very widely understood. I'm not even sure that I understood it as well as I should have. Can you explain why are you Victoria's human rights investigator? And what skill and processes do you bring to bear as an ombudsman to that function?
Well, Victoria's Human Rights Charter gives you that explicit role. I mean, there are many bodies that have important roles in the Charter, including the Equal Opportunities and Human Rights Commission. they have policy and educational roles, and they're intervening in court proceedings. But actually, the role I have in that is as an investigator.
Yes.
So.
And this is an express statutory function.
It is, yes. And you're right, it's not particularly well known, but I'm hoping it's better known since, for example, last December, when it was very clear that I had investigated the lockdown of the public housing towers and the human rights implications of that. So that's an example.
Mm. There is an aspect of your work in which I'm personally interested in view of my most recent position, which is the Commissioner with the Oral Justice Commission. When I hear you speak about your work and the function of the Ombudsman, I don't just hear somebody speak about vindication or correction of administrative injustice. I hear you speak about speaking truth to power. I hear you speak about the significance of ordinary people with high personal stakes having the opportunity to share their story, to obtain redress, but also to share that story. And it struck me that there seems to be a truth-telling component to your function, which has an analogy, not a strong analogy, but some analogy with other truth-telling processes. Am I wrong in that? Is there an aspect of?
No, you're.
Please explain that.
No, very much so. I think you're spot on. And well, let me share with you another report that I feel particularly proud of that I think illustrates that point. I was referred some years ago by the then Department of Transport, concerns they had about historical sex abuse claims involving a serial sex offender connected to Puffing Billy. Now, this had all happened decades before. The man, Robert Whitehead, had died in prison. So, he'd been convicted and he had died in prison. But there were lingering and continuing concerns being raised by some of the victims of that serial sex offence, that the statutory authorities of the time had known and failed to act, that it wasn't just about this man who had committed the offences, that there was actually a more systemic and troubling governmental aspect of this that that people felt had been covered up. So this was referred to me by the department, who had been dealing with complainants and who really felt they didn't have the skills, the investigative ability, and so on to deal with this. And I remember when I agreed to take it on, I did it on the basis, and I know about historical investigations. They're really difficult. They can be very thankless, but they're also incredibly important. They can be, when the stakes are high enough, incredibly important to help people somehow come to terms with what has happened to them. So I began the investigation. And I remember saying to the team at the start, because we had there were huge amounts of material to be got through. And I said, well, if we do nothing else with this investigation, we need to tell the story. We need to tell people's story. And at the time, I didn't expect that we would find what we did, about the massive failures that we did in fact expose within Puffing Billy, within the railways establishment of the time, the number of people who knew and failed to act, because that is what the investigation did find. But I remember that message at the time. People need to hear their story back. To
hear their story, to have it shared and acknowledged. Yes.
And one of the things that says, and it still stayed with me, and this may be, I think, relevant in the terms of your commission. One of my recommendations in that report was a public apology to the victims of Puffing Billy. And I had the experience of sitting in Parliament House surrounded by a number of those victims to listen to the apology, which was delivered by not only, the government, but, and numbers of ministers, including the Premier, but by the opposition, by, everybody got up to deliver or acknowledge that apology. And I could feel it in the people around me. These were people who had lived with this abuse for decades, who had felt ignored, who had felt belittled, who had simply not had their experience, their terrible experience had remained unvalidated until that moment. So for me, the power, no matter how long ago that these terrible things happened, the power of the acknowledgement, the power of the apology, the power of that validation that actually you were right. This was not your fault. These bad things did happen. That stays with me, and that I think is really important for the Europe Commission as well.
Looking at your work history, I noticed something very interesting, which is a real concern for the position of people in various forms of custody. You've already mentioned being a police visitor. You were a member of the Independent Police Complaints Commission in London, looking at deaths in custody. I'm aware of your work in conducting an assessment based on the optional protocol for the Convention Against Torture in respect of the Dame Phyllis Frost Women's Prison. It goes on, the solitary confinement of children and young offenders, the same kind of report. And of course, you launched an own motions inquiry into the social housing tower lockdowns, to which you've already referred, which involves issues of detention, which are canvassed extensively in your report. This seems to be a long-term interest of yours, the position of vulnerable people in custody. Can you expand upon that interest and where it may have come from?
If you're in my position, and indeed in the positions I've been in, the people who have been deprived of their liberty by the state are, by definition, some of the most vulnerable people in our society. And this is not because they have been unjustly deprived of their liberty. There are court processes that are designed to ensure that that convictions, we would hope convictions are safe. You would know more about that than I do. But once they're behind bars, they become non-persons. And it is important that they don't lose all of their rights. That the punishment is deprivation of liberty. It's not that they should not be treated with the respect and dignity that all human beings actually deserve. So the Ombudsman's Office, for example, has had a direct phone line to all Victorian prisons since 2006. So we get a lot of complaints from prisoners, and I think that's a really good thing. It's really important. It means that even though people are behind bars, that they can, not only can they contact us, but actually people in prison also know they can contact us, and what that does is change behaviour.
The social housing towers investigation is a recent example of how fundamental and how necessary the Office of the Ombudsman in Victoria is. Perhaps I'll give a brief account of what happened for those who are not familiar with it. 3,000 people in 9 towers were locked down without notice by the government during the COVID-19 situation. Then there was no planning. Human rights did not appear to have been considered. Your investigators were on the ground very quickly on the very day concerned, and by on the ground, I really do mean on the ground in the places concerned. Yes. Your investigation was and remains the main mechanism through which the rights of the individuals concerned were examined. And you reported on human rights breaches and called for an apology, which has been rejected. I wonder if you could comment upon this particular case as an example of the importance of the role of the Ombudsman with respect to human rights protection.
Well, let me just say at the outset that I have a fabulous, dedicated staff, who are passionate about human rights.
Yes.
It is they were not, directed to go to the public housing towers on Saturday night. I can tell you, they chose to go because they were concerned and they wanted to see, what was happening and to be on the ground. And we had these conversations, over the coming days of, is there a role for the Ombudsman here? What do we do? We were receiving complaints, and it seemed like at the time we had no idea of what we would find.
No,
but it seemed really important to investigate this, to remind governments of the importance of human rights and human rights decision making. That assessment, how that is, it's not just something you pay lip service to, it's not tick the box that says human rights assessment, it's have you actually considered human rights and recognizing that human rights is a balancing act, they're not absolute. I got numerous complaints over the pandemic about just the fact of the lockdowns. And I didn't investigate every complaint I received about lockdowns, but I did investigate these because on the face of it, why was it necessary to lock people down without any notice whatsoever? This was the only lockdown before or since that was made with no notice, which meant that people could not get essential supplies, medication, food, essential services, and for many people, the first they saw was police surrounding the building. And for many people in that building who had come from war-torn zones, that was re-traumatizing. People who just suddenly they were in prison and they didn't know why.
It's interesting to reflect on the capacity of the Ombudsman, say 10 years ago, or well longer than that, before the Charter. In other words, in a non-human rights age, and to ask the question whether the Ombudsman could have been the main means by which human rights violations that you identified could have been investigated. I think that the answer must obviously be no. I think the Ombudsman has always been before we had a charter, before we were kind of conscious of human rights language, the Ombudsman institution goes back to, the Roman tribune of the plebs was a kind of ombudsman. It goes back thousands of years. It's fundamentally that institution to provide, to address the imbalance of power between the individual and the state. And there are so many manifestations of that imbalance of power and, what institution might be in place. So the Ombudsman, if you look at this in historical terms, it's been around for much, much longer than human rights institutions and our consciousness of human rights. But that doesn't mean the principles that the Ombudsman addresses haven't always been similar. I think the Ombudsman back in the 70s, before there was a charter, and in the 80s, those ombudsmen were dealing with human rights in prisons, much as I am. Much as you are. Yes, yes. Thank you. This has been a fascinating interview, I must say, and I want to end it with something in which I'm personally interested, and that is the way that ombudsmen work in other jurisdictions, the relationship between the Ombudsman and national human rights institutions, like here, the Victorian Equal Opportunity Human Rights Commission, or at the national level, the Australian Human Rights Commission. I know that you were a member of the International Ombudsman's Body for some time and have got a special insight into this. What is the relationship between human rights investigation and vindication in other countries as regards the relationship between national human rights institutions and Ombudsman?
Well, it depends.
Yes. Yes.
It's difficult to sort of I don't want to oversimplify this.
No.
But in broad terms, the way I'd roughly characterize it is, in those countries where there is a long-standing ombudsman institution, then there's usually a separate, recently formed human rights body, that gets tasked to do the specific human rights work that has come from recent human rights legislation.
Yes.
Whatever that looks like,
which
is very much a sort of post-Second World War
phenomena.
Development.
Yes.
But around the world, many ombudsmen are also the National Human Rights Institution. And
I see.
Certainly, the ombudsmen that are created more recently tend to have a combination of the roles. So, for example, many ombudsmen are the National Preventative Mechanism under OPCAT, the
Yes.
United Nations Treaty on the Prevention of Torture, which, for those who aren't familiar with this, gives them a direct role to go into closed environments, prisons, youth justice, all forms of closed environment, to ensure that those essential provisions are complied with. So so the concerns around this, the well-being of people in custody is an ombudsman mandate. It's a human rights mandate, and in many parts of the world they are found in one place. Not always. We have a kind of I think we also have a partnership. So where we're not the same institution, we work together. I have close contact with our human rights institutions, both at state and federal level. We do different things, but I hope we complement each other.
Thank you. Deborah Glass, Victorian's Ombudsman, thank you. Thank you on behalf of myself and on behalf of our audience of this, the third episode in my series, Human Rights Leaders in Conversation. Thank you for your time. Thank you for the contribution that you are making as a human rights leader in the discharge of your office as an ombudsman. Good night.
My pleasure.